I watched my beloved Victorian home burn to ashes while my HOA neighbor, Margaret, smugly sipped her coffee, thinking she had finally won our war. Little did she know, I was a federal judge with the power to destroy everything she had built. But how far would she push me before I revealed my true identity? The morning started like any other, with me sipping coffee on my grandmother's century-old porch swing, watching the sunrise paint the sky pink over our Victorian home's iconic purple trim. That's when I spotted her, Margaret Thompson, power walking toward my mailbox with an envelope clutched in her manicured hands like it was made of gold. I'd seen that determined look before. During the neighborhood meetings she'd started hosting at her newly renovated McMansion next door. My stomach tightened as she dropped the envelope in my mailbox and lingered, taking photos of my front yard with her phone. My grandmother's roses were in full bloom, their wild beauty a stark contrast to Margaret's perfectly trimmed boxwood hedges. I knew she hated every unruly petal. The envelope contained what she called an exciting opportunity, a formal invitation to join their newly formed HOA, complete with a glossy brochure showing identical beige houses with matching mailboxes. The membership fee was $5,000, with monthly dues of $5,000, with monthly dues of $350. But that wasn't what made my hands shake. It was the mandatory property modifications list attached. Remove all non-approved paint colors, including my grandmother's beloved purple trim. Replace the heritage rose garden with approved vegetation. And take down the antique wind chimes that had sung me to sleep every night since childhood. I watched Margaret through my window as she walked back to her house, phone pressed to her ear. Yes, I just delivered the final invitation. She'll have to join now. Her house is the last holdout on the street, she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness that made my skin crawl. Once we get her property in line, this neighborhood's value will skyrocket. That evening, I walked to Margaret's house, invitation in hand. Her doorbell played a chiming version of We Are the Champions. Of course it did. She answered wearing a neighborhood watch captain badge, her lips stretched into what she probably thought was a welcoming smile. I've reviewed your invitation, I said calmly, my years of professional experience keeping my voice steady. I need to decline. This house has been in my family for 3 generations, and I intend to preserve its historic character. Her smile vanished faster than free cookies at a bake sale. You don't understand, she said, leaning forward. This isn't really an invitation. The HOA has already been registered. Your property is surrounded by HOA members. You have to join. I pulled out the property maps I'd researched that afternoon. Actually, that's incorrect. My deed predates any HOA agreements, and I have no legal obligation to join. 20 years of legal experience had taught me to always do my homework. Margaret's face turned an interesting shade of red. Listen here, she hissed, dropping the fake niceness. This neighborhood is changing. Progress is happening. If you don't get with the program, things might get difficult. Accidents happen to houses that don't meet code. Citations get filed. Fines add up. I met her gaze steadily. Is that a threat, Mrs. Thompson? She stepped back, her sugary smile returning. Of course not. I'm just concerned about your property values and safety. Old houses like yours can be so unpredictable, electrical problems, structural issues. It would be terrible if something happened because you refused to modernize. Behind her, I could see her husband, Robert, watching through their window, phone in hand. Something about his stance made me uneasy. I nodded politely and turned to leave, but Margaret's voice stopped me. 1 week, she called after me. You have 1 week to reconsider before the HOA board meets to discuss enforcement options. Walking home, I noticed new faces watching from their windows, Margaret's HOA allies, no doubt. Something told me this wasn't going to end with a simple declined invitation. I spent that night installing security cameras around my property, making sure to document their current condition. I learned long ago to trust my instincts, and right now, they were screaming that Margaret Thompson was just getting started. What I didn't know then was that this wasn't just about property values or purple trim. In my 3 decades of dealing with difficult people, I'd never encountered someone like Margaret. As I fell asleep to the gentle sound of my grandmother's wind chimes, I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a war that would change everything, and that my beloved Victorian home would become its first casualty. But Margaret had made one crucial mistake in choosing her target. She just didn't know it yet. The war begins. The morning started with Margaret's shrill voice outside my window. Look at those hideous purple trims. They're destroying our property values. I peeked through my curtains to find her leading a group of HOA members on what they called their morning inspection. My heart sank as I watched them photograph every inch of my grandmother's beloved home. I tried to enjoy my morning coffee on the porch, but their whispers carried across the lawn. Did you see those ancient wind chimes? They're not HOA approved. And those roses, they're 3 inches taller than regulation. Every day brought new complaints, each more ridiculous than the last. They started leaving warning letters, bright orange papers taped to my door, about violations that didn't exist before their HOA. My heritage rose garden, planted by my grandmother herself, was suddenly a neighborhood nuisance. The authentic Victorian purple trim, which tourists used to photograph, became their biggest target. One Tuesday morning, I found Margaret measuring my grass with a ruler. 11.5 inches, she announced triumphantly to her sidekick, Barbara, who furiously scribbled in a notebook. That's 3.5 inches over code. I walked out calmly, coffee in hand. You're trespassing on private property, I stated firmly, knowing my legal rights but keeping my profession private. Margaret just smirked and took more photos. The harassment got creative. They'd schedule landscapers to show up at 7 a.m. sharp on Saturdays, their equipment conveniently loudest near my bedroom window. Anonymous complaints to code enforcement became weekly events. Each time, I calmly showed the officials my property's historic status documentation, watching Margaret fume from her window. They tried psychological warfare next. Margaret organized HOA meetings in her driveway, right outside my home office. I'd hear them discussing how some people were bringing down the neighborhood's reputation, how certain houses needed to be dealt with for everyone's good. My security cameras caught them testing my patience. They'd let their dogs use my yard as a bathroom, then act shocked when I showed them the footage. Oh, my precious Bentley would never. Margaret would gasp, clutching her pearls while her massive golden doodle left another present on my lawn. The breaking point came during their annual block party. I wasn't invited, of course, but I could hear Margaret loudly discussing plans to revitalize the neighborhood. Some older properties, she announced, glancing at my house, just don't fit our community vision anymore. That's when I noticed people taking photos of my home's foundation, whispering about structural concerns. I stayed calm, documenting everything. Each letter, every photo, all the anonymous complaints. I filed them methodically. When they installed bright security lights aimed at my bedroom windows, I added light pollution to my growing evidence file. My grandmother taught me patience, and as I watched Margaret's group grow bolder, I knew timing would be everything. The final straw. That night, reviewing my security footage, I caught something disturbing. 2 HOA board members were examining my property line markers, whispering about easement regulations. I recognized that look. They were planning something bigger. But what they didn't know was that I'd spent my career dealing with people who thought they were above the law. As I turned off my porch light that evening, watching Margaret's group huddle in her driveway, I wondered how long I should wait before showing them exactly who they were messing with. I never expected to find Margaret and 2 other HOA board members skulking around my property at midnight. But there they were, illuminated by my kitchen light as I got up for a glass of water. My heart stopped when I saw the chemical sprayers in their hands, pointed directly at my grandmother's century-old rose garden. What do you think you're doing? I called out from my porch, phone already recording. Margaret jumped but quickly regained her composure, that fake smile spreading across her face like poison. Oh, we're just helping eliminate these invasive species, she said sweetly, continuing to spray my roses. The HOA has strict rules about non-native plants. If you just join us, we could handle these issues properly. I walked closer, blood boiling but voice steady. Those aren't invasive species, Margaret. They're heritage Victorian roses, planted by my grandmother in 1960. I have the original documentation and Gardening Society registration. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, but Margaret stood her ground. Well, someone complained about the smell, she sniffed, adjusting her designer pajamas. And these thorns are a safety hazard for children walking by. On my private property, behind my fence, I challenged, switching on my security lights. The property line is clearly marked, and you're trespassing. That's when Robert, Margaret's husband, emerged from the shadows. As a retired police sergeant, he thought he could intimidate anyone. Now, let's not throw around accusations. We're just trying to maintain neighborhood standards. Nobody wants to live next to a jungle. I noticed Mrs. Watson, my elderly neighbor across the street, peeking through her curtains. She'd been bullied into joining the HOA last month after similar late-night visits. Her beautiful rock garden had been replaced with Margaret-approved generic shrubs within days. The next morning, my roses were dead. Their once vibrant petals turned black and withered. But Margaret had made a crucial mistake. She'd unknowingly revealed the HOA's pattern of targeting specific homeowners. The fall of Margaret Thompson. I spent my lunch break at the county records office, discovering that every house that initially refused to join the HOA had experienced mysterious accidents or code violations until they sold. I installed high-def security cameras that afternoon, hiding them carefully among my remaining plants. That evening, Margaret paraded potential buyers past my property. "Of course, this eyesore will be dealt with soon," she announced loudly. "We have ways of handling difficult residents." The following week brought an endless stream of harassment. My mailbox was knocked over 3 times. Anonymous complaints were filed about noise on days I wasn't even home. Code enforcement officers appeared daily, finding nothing but returning anyway. My garbage bins disappeared, only to be found in violation of HOA rules. I documented everything meticulously, building my case quietly. But Margaret's group grew bolder. They started hosting HOA meetings in front of my house, pointing out every perceived flaw to potential new residents. "This property is driving down home values," Margaret would declare, waving her designer handbag for emphasis. "But don't worry, it won't be a problem much longer." The final straw came when I caught them tampering with my historic fence posts, carefully loosening them while pretending to measure the sidewalk. My security cameras caught Margaret instructing her minions. "Once these posts fail inspection, she'll have to replace the whole fence with our approved model. That'll cost her thousands, unless she joins the HOA, of course." That night, as I reviewed the footage, I noticed something strange. The HOA's inspection team always included someone taking photos of my electrical boxes, gas lines, and other utilities. They were methodically documenting every potential vulnerability of my home. But why? The pieces were starting to come together, and the picture they formed sent a chill down my spine. I knew I needed to act fast, but I couldn't reveal my hand too soon. What I didn't know then was that Margaret had already set in motion a plan that would change everything, a plan that would bring all my worst fears blazing to life. The fire. My hands trembled as I held up the morning paper, reading the headline about how I'd just sentenced a corrupt CO to prison. The courtroom was dead silent when my clerk, Emily, burst through the doors, her face ghost white. "Your Honor, your house, it's on fire." Those 5 words made my blood run cold. I threw off my black robes and raced down the courthouse steps, my heart pounding against my chest. 15 minutes, that's all it took to drive home, but it felt like forever. I could see the black smoke rising from 3 blocks away, and my stomach turned to ice. The gorgeous purple trim my grandmother had lovingly painted was now being eaten away by angry orange flames. As I screeched to a halt in front of my burning home, firefighters were already battling the inferno. The heat hit me like a wall, and I could hear the ancient wooden beams groaning under the assault of the flames. Everything my family had built over 3 generations was disappearing before my eyes. Through my tears, I spotted Margaret standing in her driveway, in her designer yoga pants, sipping her overpriced coffee like she was watching a morning show. Her perfectly styled blonde hair gleamed in the sunlight as she chatted with other HOA board members. They weren't even trying to hide their satisfaction, whispering and pointing at different parts of my burning home. Fire Chief Martinez approached me, his face grim. "Ma'am, it looks like an electrical fire. These old houses, their wiring can be dangerous." But I knew better. Just yesterday, I'd had my annual electrical inspection. Everything was up to code, just like always. I'd made sure of it after Margaret's threats about unsafe historic properties at the last town meeting. My security cameras, the thought hit me like lightning. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking as I tried to access the footage. The screen was blank. The cameras had mysteriously stopped recording at 3 a.m., exactly 4 hours before the fire started. This was no coincidence. As I watched my home burn, memories flashed through my mind. Learning to bake cookies in that kitchen with Grandma, celebrating my law school graduation in the garden, my first day as a judge. all going up in smoke because I wouldn't bow to Margaret's demands to join her precious HOA. Through the crowd of onlookers, I spotted two familiar faces, Robert Johnson and Mike Peters, both HOA board members, trying to blend in with the growing crowd of neighbors. But their shoes caught my eye, the same distinctive work boots I'd seen on my security footage last week when my rose bushes were vandalized. Now they were covered in what looked like fresh mud, or was it ash? Margaret strutted over, her face a mask of fake concern. "Oh, this is just terrible. If only you joined our HOA. We have such strict safety requirements. But you were so stubborn about keeping things historic." She emphasized the last word like it was dirty, taking another slow sip of her coffee. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. Not yet. I couldn't reveal my hand yet. Instead, I watched as she pulled out her phone, quickly typing something. Moments later, I overheard another neighbor talking about a fantastic deal on premium land that had just been listed in some exclusive real estate group. The fire department finally got the blaze under control, but it was too late. The beautiful Victorian windows were shattered, the hand-carved porch railings were charred beyond recognition, and the roof had partially collapsed. A century of history, destroyed in just hours. As I stood there, watching the smoke rise into the morning sky, I made a decision. Margaret thought she'd won. She thought she'd broken me. But she just made the biggest mistake of her life. The reckoning. I pulled out my phone and made 3 calls. One to my friend at the FBI, one to my contact at the state attorney's office, and one to a private investigator I trusted. I caught Margaret watching me make those calls, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face for just a moment. She didn't know who I was calling, but something in my determined stance must have worried her. Good. Let her worry. Because while my house lay in ruins, my real power had nothing to do with property and everything to do with justice. As the sun rose higher in the sky, I picked up a small charred piece of the purple trim. Grandma had always told me that sometimes you have to lose everything to gain the strength to fight back. Looking at Margaret's smug face one last time, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. But first, I had to understand just how deep this HOA's corruption really went. Standing in the ashes of my grandmother's home, I made a promise that turned my grief into purpose. While Margaret paraded around the neighborhood, spreading rumors that I'd burn my own house for insurance money, I was quietly pulling threads that would unravel her entire empire. The trial. The morning of the trial felt different. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, straightening my judge's robe, thinking about how Margaret had laughed when my house burned. Now she wasn't laughing anymore. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, reporters, and victims from other neighborhoods who'd come forward after seeing our story on the local news. Margaret walked in wearing an expensive suit instead of her usual yoga pants, but her face turned ghost white when she saw me sitting at the bench. I'll never forget how she grabbed her lawyer's arm and whispered, "That's her, the one whose house we burned." Her lawyer dropped his pen. The evidence we presented was shocking. Our investigation had uncovered 15 other houses that mysteriously caught fire after refusing to join Margaret's HOA. The pattern was always the same: harassment, vandalism, then fire. They'd buy the burned properties for pennies through a shell company owned by Margaret's brother-in-law. They'd already made millions. We played the security footage from my cameras. The whole courtroom gasped, watching Margaret and her HOA friends spreading gasoline around my grandmother's rose bushes at 2 a.m. Margaret kept shaking her head, mouthing no, as her own voice came through the speakers. Once it burns, she'll have to sell. The real surprise came when Margaret's husband, the retired police sergeant, turned against her. He'd been keeping quiet out of loyalty, but seeing the evidence broke him. He told everything. How they planned it all, how they picked their targets, how they bribed local officials to look the other way. Margaret screamed, "Liar," so loud the bailiff had to remove her. One by one, people stood up to tell their stories. Mrs. Rodriguez, the retired teacher who lost her family photos. The Patel family, whose grandfather's ashes were destroyed. Each story made Margaret shrink smaller in her chair. Her designer suit couldn't hide how scared she was now. When I read the verdict, my voice didn't shake. 25 years for Margaret. 15 for each board member. Their faces showed they finally understood. No amount of money could save them from justice. Margaret tried to give a speech about how she was just trying to protect property values, but I cut her off the same way she'd cut off my explanations about my grandmother's roses. Rebuilding. That was 6 months ago. Today, I'm watching the construction workers put the finishing touches on my rebuilt Victorian. The purple trim is exactly how Grandma painted it. The rose garden is coming back with cuttings from the one surviving bush. Margaret's house was sold to pay victim compensation. A lovely immigrant family lives there now. Their kids play in the yard where Margaret used to stand, taking photos of my violations. The new neighbors created a real community association, not an HOA, but a group that actually helps each other. We have block parties in my garden. Everyone brings food and shares stories. Yesterday, Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous empanadas and showed me the family photos her daughter had managed to restore from damaged albums. Sometimes, when I'm working in my garden, people stop to thank me, not for being a judge, but for standing up to bullies. The local news did a follow-up story about how we transformed from the neighborhood Margaret terrorized into a real community. They interviewed the Patels, who now host our monthly meetings in their beautiful backyard. I keep Margaret's coffee cup on my desk at the courthouse, the one she dropped when she realized who I was. It reminds me that justice might work slowly, but it works surely, just like my grandmother always said. And every morning, I sip my own coffee in my rose garden, watching the sun rise through my perfectly purple-trimmed windows, knowing that sometimes the best revenge is simply rebuilding something more beautiful than what was destroyed.